Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out and happy Tuesday. And we're really excited tonight to have Dr. Cathy Chien from Gilead, who is an HIV provider. Can you hear me? Oh, use the mic. Use the mic. Hello, can you hear me now? Okay, much better. But I don't have to shout. Use my inside voice. So we're really excited to have Dr. Chien here tonight. And she is going to be giving an update on the CROI conference that happened in early March in San Francisco. A lot of interesting data. That's the premier HIV conference that happens every year. And then just a couple of announcements coming up. Next month will be our annual women's conference, and that'll be happening at the Mizell on Saturday the 14th. So you're welcome to come. If you know any women living with HIV or people who work with women with HIV, please encourage them to come. Just go to our website and sign up so we have a good headcount for food. It's coming out. And then also next month's program will be just that in front of me. Oh, it's going to be on. Yeah, body dysmorphia and HIV and HIV. Ami student who spoke before. So that should be a great program. So that'll be our last program of the first half of the year. And then, of course, we always take our summer hiatus in July and August and come back in September to over there. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Dr. Chien.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. So hi, everyone.
Hello.
It's nice to see you all. I know we have a couple of familiar faces in the room. So for all of you that I haven't met, my name is Cathy Chien, and I am the HIV medical scientist with Gilead Sciences. So my background, I'm a physician by training and internist, and a long time ago, I did a fellowship in HIV medicine, and I practiced for about 12 years at AIDS Healthcare Foundation. I'm based in Los Angeles, so I was working at the time at the downtown Los Angeles office. And I cared for a largely kind of uninsured, underinsured patient population. We were kind of adjacent to Skid Row. So we took care of a lot of, unstably housed patients living with HIV. And it was a really, really rewarding population to work with. I absolutely enjoyed it and learned a lot. Okay, so then about 11 years ago, I transitioned into this role at Gilead. And it's been a really nice transition because when I was in clinic, I was always full-time, doing clinical work. I didn't get to attend these, really big scientific conferences. And now in my role at Gilead, I've been able to attend this conference along with other conferences. And what our team does is we come back after the conference and we hash out all the data that was presented, what were people talking about, what were the hot topics. And we put together these conference summary slide decks, which is what I have here for you guys tonight. These are the very kind of data heavy, science heavy slides, but Jeff told me that this group is very savvy and curious to learn all of these things. So, I'm going to do my best to contextualize, what this information is and why it might be relevant to all of you. And I also welcome you all to ask questions as we go along and, have a discussion. I want this to be meaningful, for the time that you're spending. Okay. So with that, I'll get started, and I'm going to stay down here if that's okay. It seems too formal to be standing on the stage, and I might fall. Okay. So, oh no, now this. Oh. Oops. There we go. Sorry. Okay. So this is a disclaimer slide that is on, you'll see this double dagger symbol. Pretty much. Just a reminder that because this is data that was presented at a conference, it may not be necessarily on drugs that are already FDA approved, or it may not be on an indication that's currently available. This is a lot of clinical research. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the first few slides are dealing more with big picture. where are we today in ending the HIV epidemic? Okay, so one of the presentations at the conference was looking at the global HIV epidemic, right? And basically, this is data from 2023, the most recent data. And globally, there's just under 40 million people living with HIV. And what you see on this slide is in 2023, there were 1.3 million new infections. Okay, so I'm going to ask a brave soul out there to guess. This is global data, right? Out of 40 million people living with HIV globally, what percentage of those people do you think are cisgender women?
More than half.
More than half, exactly. So 53% of the global population of people living with HIV are actually cisgender women. So it's very different than, what I see in my patient population in Los Angeles, and I'm sure what you all experience out here as well. But I always like to put that in context. When we think about that 1.3 million new infections, about 44% of those are also in cisgender women, so adolescent girls and young women. Okay. So if you remember, UNAIDS came out with some goals, right? Some global goals that you might have heard 90-90-90 or 95-95-95. And what that was that by the year 2030, we would have 95% of the global population of people living with HIV just aware of their diagnosis. And then the second 95 is having 95% of those people in care and on treatment. And that third 95 is saying 95% of those people undetectable. Okay, and so the other part of those UNAIDS goals was that by 2025, which is right now, globally, our new infections would be less than 370,000. Okay, so you can see in 2023 at 1.3 million, we're nowhere near that. Okay, and then the map shows you the darker the color, the more dense the new infections are in that area. So you can get an idea of what things look like globally. So now I'm going to shift to some data in the US. Okay, so this is a busy slide, but this is a mathematical modeling slide. Okay, so in the US, the president came out with a plan for America several years ago, and that was that, so it was in 2020, that in 5 years, in 2025, where we are now, we will have reduced new HIV infections in the US by 75%. And by the year 2030, we would have reduced new infections in the US by 90%. And that would be effectively ending the HIV epidemic. That would mean new infections in the US were rare. Okay. And what this slide is showing us is that, sorry. Okay. So this yellow line is showing status quo. So if we kind of keep trucking along the way we have been here in the US, this is our goal. If we were to reduce new HIV infections in the US by 90% by 2030, we would be here. This is annual new infections on the y-axis. So we're way off target. You can see that, right? So what this modeling exercise was trying to do is to say, what if we optimized everything? If we optimized testing, so they looked at all these parameters here. So HIV testing frequency. What if we got people to get tested once a year? That would be kind of a low target. A high target would be everybody would get tested twice a year. Okay. What we're doing now, again, status quo, is that on average, someone in the US is getting tested every 82 months. Right. So we're nowhere near either of those goals. If we look at something like linkage to care, right? When you think about the HIV care continuum, once someone is diagnosed, the next step is to link them to care. The next step is to keep them engaged in care, right? It's not enough to just get them to make one visit to a care clinic. They need to get on treatment, stay undetectable. And that's where we get the benefits of U equals U, right? Undetectable equals untransmissible, right? So they said, okay, what if we increase linkage to care? Right now, we're at about 77% of people in the US are linked to care. But if we could increase that to 90%, or on the extreme to 98%, how would that look? What about engagement in care 2 years out? So that's 90% to 98%. These are lofty goals. Okay, keep that in mind, because we're at about 75% for that statistic. Okay, and then they looked at PrEP coverage. What if we got more people who could benefit on PrEP? right? So when we're thinking about ending the HIV epidemic, whether we're talking about the US or globally, there's two big concepts, right? There's U equals U. If we could look into a crystal ball and identify everyone in the US that was living with HIV, get all of those people on treatment, get all of those people undetectable, we will have ended HIV because undetectable is untransmissible, right? So if the entire US population living with HIV was undetectable, no more new infections. That's obviously easier said than done. So as of 2012, we had our first FDA-approved drug for PrEP, for HIV prevention. So now, while we're trying to get everyone diagnosed on treatment and undetectable, we can simultaneously also test people, identify people that have ongoing potential risks, and get those people who could benefit from PrEP on PrEP. So if we do those things together, we can maybe get there faster. Okay, so what this modeling was showing us was that we could get there by the year 2038 if we did all of those things I mentioned at the extreme, at the high level. Okay, so that almost seems impossible when you think about, testing everyone in the US twice a year, all those numbers I told you. Okay, but the single most, so this is all mathematical modeling, right? It's using real data, but it's extrapolating to show us what has the biggest impact. So out of all of those parameters I talked about, you might be surprised to know the one that had the biggest impact on reducing new infections was that engagement in care at 2 years. Okay, so I see some head nods, right? So they said if we could hit just that target, 98% of people living with HIV could stay engaged in care for at least 2 years, we will reduce new infections by 67%. So that one thing would make that much of a difference. So it kind of surprised me because with all that we talk about for getting people on PrEP, really what this modeling showed us is that the best bang for our buck is to get people living with HIV on treatment, in care, engaged in care, and undetectable. Okay? All right. So this last slide I have in this series is looking at how far we've come with regards to mortality. So this is the HOPS cohort, which some of you may have heard of. It's a large prospective US cohort, and they've been collecting data for years, you can see. So just for historical reference, we're looking here at mortality rates. Okay, so this is trended mortality per 100 person years. And this is from 1997. So if you remember, things really changed for HIV in 1996, right? That's the advent of HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy. And so from 1997 on, you see this nice gradual decline in mortality. And then what they wanted to look at is how are we doing in this sort of modern era? So 2007 to 2021, let's look at the mortality rates in this cohort. Okay, so what this translates to, there's two lines. The orange line is looking at HIV and AIDS related mortality. So probably not surprising to you guys, right? That those mortality rates have gone down tremendously, right? Because our treatments have gotten so much better over the years, more effective, easier to take. So people can live with HIV. They are not dying from HIV anymore. They're living with HIV, they're living longer with HIV, they're aging with HIV. And really what they're ultimately dying from is non-HIV or AIDS related conditions. So heart disease, stroke, cardiovascular disease, right? No longer dying from AIDS related complications. So that's the good news. They also looked at a number of factors to see, well, what is contributing again to higher risk of mortality in people living with HIV in this sort of modern era. And it's not surprising, right? There's the things we can't control, like race and ethnicity, kind of the social determinants of health, whether you're on public insurance or private insurance. They found some trends there. But the number one strongest correlation is still low CD4 count, right? That had the highest correlation, having a CD4 count under 200, had the highest correlation with increased risk of mortality. Yes.
Is there any explanation for the trend going up after 19?
Yeah, so if you look at those, all of those have confidence intervals, so there is some variability, but there isn't anything kind of that was mentioned that was sort of statistically relevant in that small increase. Okay.
But that will go up as we get older.
Yes, yes. So we do have an aging population of people living with HIV. We expect the sort of all-cause mortality to go up more than the HIV/AIDS related. Okay.
COVID didn't have an impact on that timeframe?
It could have,
So,
yeah, it absolutely could have. Mhm. Yeah, so they did, they looked at some comorbidities, but not, they unfortunately didn't look at COVID specifically. So, things that like having cardiovascular disease, renal disease, or cancer obviously was associated with higher mortality. But then, like I said, I always like to look at the things that we can change, that we can help improve. So we can work on, helping people get off of injection drugs. We can try and help people quit smoking. Those things have huge benefits when it comes to mortality. And this, right? We can by normalizing HIV testing so that it's not, people don't wait until they're symptomatic. I mean, in the early days, that's why most people that found out, by the time they found out they were testing HIV positive, they were already very advanced because back then there was so much stigma, there was so much fear around getting tested. So it's very, we're trying to move that needle to where we normalize testing. It's part of your, primary care, just like your doctor's checking your cholesterol at your annual physicals, they should also be doing a full STD screen so that we can prevent these late presenters, right? Prevent people from ever presenting with a CD400 or 200. Okay, so any questions or comments on that? Okay, so the next data I'm going to get into certain studies that are looking at comparative drug regimens now. Okay, so again, for those of you that have been following all the classes of drugs that we've used over the years, you know that we started with protease inhibitors and non-nukes, NNRTIs, and where we are today, you could say we're in the integrase era, right? So if you look at guidelines today, someone who's newly diagnosed walking into an office, what the guidelines recommend starting that individual on is an integrase INSTI-based regimen. So we're talking about something like Biktarvy or something like Triumeq or dolutegravir Tivicay, right? So those are integrase-based regimens. And the reason for that is that we know that these drugs are very effective. So they're very good at getting the virus undetectable. Obviously, that's important. They're very well tolerated, right? Think back to the early days, people were taking handfuls of pills 2 or 3 times a day with a lot of side effects. Hard to convince a patient to stay on a regimen that they probably, back then felt better off treatment than they did on treatment, right? So our modern medications are thankfully no longer like that. They have limited side effects. So I remember having a patient come in and saying, how are you doing? And she was like, I'm like, not good. I don't think these meds are working. And I'm like, why? What happened? And she was like, I don't feel anything. And I said, that's a good thing. Then I looked at her labs and of course she was undetectable, she was doing great. But I think it was like people were coming into treatment thinking that these medicines are going to make me feel bad. And that's not the case anymore. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So what this study is looking at, and this might be getting a little too much in the weeds, but we were talking about people presenting late, right? So we still see this, unfortunately, what we call late presenters, people who at the time that they're diagnosed, their CD4 count is already very low. Okay, so these are people with an AIDS diagnosis when they're diagnosed, meaning that their CD4 count is under 200, or that they have an opportunistic infection, things like that. And so these are, you can say these are the hardest individuals to treat because we have to bring them back. We have to control typically a much higher viral load and typically a much lower CD4 count that we have to boost that immune, count over time, right? So what this group wanted to look at, it's called a laptop study, was to see how do our tried and true, I would say like when I was first treating HIV, I would always reach for a boosted protease inhibitor for someone who came in like this. And that was for a number of reasons. I mean, those medications at the time were what we consider most potent. They also had what we call a high barrier to resistance, meaning that if you have somebody with a viral load that's 1 million, right? These typically in that late stage of HIV, that's when we see the viral load start to go sky high because the virus is just getting the upper hand at this point. So CD4 counts are plummeting, under 200, under 100, under 50. Meanwhile, the viral load is going up, right? So we tend to see very high viral loads, very low CD4 counts. Like I said, this is the population that, historically was the hardest to treat. So again, this was a group we used to reach for integrase inhibitors coming on to the scene, the question is, are they as good? Will they be as effective for these very advanced patients? And so that's what this study looked at. And I'll just point out a couple of things without getting too far into it. What this graph in the middle is showing is the percentage of individuals with a viral load less than 50, so who got to undetectable. And then on the x-axis is weeks and time. So you can see the blue line represents late presenters who went on DCF-TAP. This is an abbreviation for Simtuza. This is a boosted protease inhibitor, single tablet regimen. And then the orange line are individuals in the same late presenter category who were started on Biktarvy, which is an example of an integrase-based regimen. And so what you'll notice is, even at 4 weeks, about 15% of these people reached an undetectable viral load, but not nearly as many on the boosted protease inhibitor. And you can see out to 12 weeks, that percentage was much higher for the integrase inhibitor than the boosted PI. When you get out to a year, it kind of evens out, but in those early stages, you do see a difference, okay? And so I think this data gave people more confidence that the new kid on the block, the integrase inhibitors, that we can use them, we can push them into these kind of hardest to treat situations, and that they will still perform as well as drugs that we're much more familiar with. Okay. Okay, so this is an interesting study, and I'm going to preface this by saying, do not try this at home. Okay. But one of the things, that I talked about that is important when we're thinking about how well does this drug work is barrier to resistance. How forgiving is this regimen, right? If you tell someone you have to take this pill every day for the rest of your life, right? Think about where we are today with our HIV treatment guidelines. A 25-year-old individual who's newly diagnosed walks into the office. That doctor is probably going to put them on treatment that day, right? We do rapid start now. And we're going to tell that person that they're going to stay on treatment for the rest of their lives. That 25-year-old is also going to now live to be 80 or 90, right? So that's a lot of years on medication. And how perfect do you think somebody is going to be at taking a pill every day consistently for 50 years, right? Nobody's perfect. So we often see these studies coming out of Europe for cost-saving reasons and things like that. But they like to look at using fewer drugs or dosing less frequently. So this study, in my mind, is crazy that it was done, because it really is pushing the limits of what our medications can do. So the medicine being studied here is Biktarvy again. So this is an integrase-based regimen. This is kind of our modern day recommended regimen for somebody. And they wanted to look at how patients did if they were already undetectable taking it every day. But how would they do if we had them take it 3 times a week? Monday, Wednesday, Friday. What if they took it twice a week? Tuesday, Friday. What if they took it once a week? Wednesday. So let me reiterate, do not try this at home. Okay. But I think what this study showed us is that, this is looking at drug levels. Okay. So this is looking at concentration of drug for bictegravir, one of the components of Biktarvy. And not surprisingly, the people who took it daily, which is what QD stands for, their levels stay very high, but all the other, intermittent dosing, you can see the drug levels, were very low, okay, both in the cells and in the plasma. Despite that, though, when we look at the percentage of people who stayed undetectable, less than 50, whether they took it daily, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, it didn't seem to make a difference over a year. Okay, this is, it's not long-term dosing like this, but still a year is a long time, okay? And then we only started to see that drop off in efficacy with the people who took it once a week. More importantly, despite, having 30%, which was really only 2 patients, it's a very small study too, keep that in mind, but 2 patients who had a detectable viral load, they didn't develop resistance. Okay, so one of the things with older medications that we've cycled through over the years, the non-nukes, the boosted PIs, et cetera, is typically when patients fail on those regimens, meaning their viral load breaks through, they're no longer undetectable, they often have resistance. So that means we can't put them back on that same regimen, right? With the second generation, what we're calling integrase inhibitors like bictegravir, dolutegravir, we're seeing in clinical trials, no resistance for years on treatment. And that was unheard of with the older medications we use. And this is just extreme to say that if somebody is missing a few doses a week, how will they do? I mean, this is obviously modeling very consistent non-adherence. So, like I said, taking Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday, it's consistently inconsistent, right? But I think this data, for me, when I see this, it gives me confidence that when I tell my patient, like, yes, you need to take this every day, but again, nobody's perfect, and you may miss a dose here and there. Don't beat yourself up. More than likely that missed dose here and there is not going to do any harm. Okay, and like I said, this is pushing it really to the extremes. Okay, so again, do not do this at home. Okay, but this is what's fun about research is that we, in a very controlled way, we can study these questions and use that data in a way to then bring it back to how does it apply to someone who's taking these medications? How can this improve their experience, right? And so that's why these studies are done. Okay, so this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what we're moving into in HIV treatment is long-acting injectables. So how many of you are familiar with Cabenuva? I see some hands, right? So for the first time, how many years ago, in 2021, I think it got approved in January 2021. So for the first time, we had an injectable regimen that could control people living with HIV. So the way the drug is used, on label, the drug is called Cabenuva, is somebody is already undetectable on oral medication. And if they want to go on to this injectable regimen, as long as they don't have any concerning prior resistance that would make this regimen not work, they can go on this injectable 2 injections, cabotegravir, which is an integrase inhibitor, and then rilpivirine, which is an injectable non-nuc for NNRTI. So those 2 drugs are injected every either 1 month or 2 months. Okay, so this group in San Diego was very, like an early adopter of Cabenuva. Their patients were asking for it. They had an amazing pharmacist that kind of implemented this program, Lucas Hill. And so in this time frame from 2021 to 2024, they had 450 plus patients on Cabenuva. Okay, and so what they did in this analysis is try to answer a question that we haven't seen a lot of people try and answer, is not the successes of Cabenuva. We've seen a lot of data showing that it's effective, but what happens when patients go off of Cabenuva? So out of that 450 plus patients that they put on Cabenuva, about 98 of them, just under 100 of them, discontinued over time. Okay, so about 20% discontinued, and they wanted to take a look at that population who discontinued and find out, A, why did they discontinue? And B, what happens when they discontinue? Can we just put them back on the oral medication that they were on prior to going on this injectable, or do we have to put them on a different regimen? So it just helps, again, add to the experience, collective experience, so that other providers can say, if I'm going to talk to my patient about the pros and cons of going on this new injectable regimen, what are the things we need to think about? Okay, so out of the, again, just under 100 who discontinued, you can see the most common reason for discontinuation is ISR, which stands for injection site reaction. So Cabenuva is injected as 2 deep IM injections in the buttocks. And about just under 30% of patients who discontinued because they're like, hey, I'd rather swallow a pill. I don't want to, deal with the needles that painful injections every 2 months. And then the next most common reasons are other adverse events, insurance challenges. I think that's always something that sadly comes up, and then patients being lost to follow-up, things like that. Okay, so this is again a real world cohort, right? This is what this particular clinic experienced among their patients who wanted to go on Cabenuva, then didn't want to be on Cabenuva, and this was the background. Then the question is, what did they go back on, right? You have to keep them on some regimen, so they all went back to some oral regimen. And most of the patients ended up on an integrase plus 2 nukes. So something like Biktarvy or Tivicay, Descovy, for example. Okay. What this arrow says is compared to what they came in on, fewer patients went back to an integrase. Okay. And so I think that's important. You'll see more patients ended up on a CPI than baseline. More patients ended up on a multi-class regimen, and more patients ended up on a 2-drug regimen. So what that, if you read the fine print of this poster, you find out that of those patients who that couldn't, about 25% of them couldn't just go back on their prior regimen. They had to go on something new. And one of the reasons for that was that they developed resistance. Okay, not all of them. I think only about a quarter of the ones who couldn't go back on their own regimen, it was because of resistance. So that's something that to me as a clinician is really important to let my patients know, if they come in and they say, hey, I saw the commercial for Cabenuva, am I eligible? So my thought process is, okay, why do you want to go on the injection? Go ahead, Bruce.
This is the INSTI or the NRT?
Yeah, so it was INSTI and or NNRTI. Okay, so so it's basically what their results are very consistent with what was seen in the large registrational trials of Cabenuva. About 1 to less than 1.5% of people would fail, and most of those people would have some resistance. Okay, whether it's INSTI or NNRTI or both. So, the concerning thing is that we can't always predict who's going to get, it's not with oral medication, right? We tell our patients, you have to take this every day. And then if again, it's happening less with our modern regimens because they have such a high barrier to resistance. And like I just said, you could miss doses and you're probably still fine, but the goal is to take it every day, right? With the injectable, patients can, again, you have to come in every 2 months and get your injection. But sometimes, and this is the part of innovation, right? This is a new kind of class of drugs that we're looking at, the injectable form, that we're learning new things. Okay, so there does seem to be a very low risk of those individuals failing, plus or minus with resistance. And that's what this is addressing, is that someone may come in and they're really happy on their oral regimen, but they want to try the injectable because it's new and different and sounds really cool. So I always just counsel patients like, okay, number one, are they eligible? So they should be undetectable on their current regimen. They should not have any known resistance to, the components of Cabenuva, so integrase or NNRTI. And if that's true, then it is an option, right? But they may or may not be able to go back on their oral regimen if they fail. So sometimes patients are like, that's okay. Like, it's really important to me to not have to take a pill every day. Like, this to me feels like a daily reminder of HIV. I would much rather get an injection. So I think the pros outweigh the cons. If it's I've had this exact conversation with a patient that I say that whole, scenario to, this is what the data has shown. And they say, you know what, I don't want to take that chance. Like, I'm doing fine on this 1 pill once a day regimen. It's so easy. I don't want to rock the boat. Because if I don't like the injection, and what if I fail with resistance, then I have to switch to something potentially more complicated. Yeah, it's not worth it, right? So it's really a lot of decisions around treatment we talk about are shared decision making. You as a patient want to know all the facts and ask all the questions so that you and your provider can make the right decision. Okay, so that's kind of what we're seeing with the injectables. Okay, so I'm going to talk a lot about like our pipeline of drugs, and again, more about what's coming in the future. And it's a new class of drug, which I'm not sure if you all have heard about yet. It's a drug called lenacapavir. Okay, has anyone heard of this drug? Great, so we have a few, you guys come to this. Doesn't count. Okay, so lenacapavir is a capsid inhibitor, so it's a new class of drug, which is exciting, right? We talked about the NRTIs, the nukes, the NNRTIs, the non-nukes, the PIs, the protease inhibitors, the INSTIs, right? So one of the challenges is people who have been living with HIV a long time, who may have cycled through a lot of those earlier drugs and maybe developed resistance back when we didn't have as good regimens with such high barriers to resistance. You can find yourself in a situation where you have someone who has very limited treatment options because of resistance. Okay, and that's where new drugs that are innovating in new classes and new mechanisms of action can come in handy, because you can't get cross resistance to these new drugs. So in other words, if I have someone who's resistant to all the nukes and non-nukes and half the PIs, they will have 100% efficacy of this new class of drug because it's a capsid inhibitor. And the way resistance happens on the genome of a virus, you can't develop resistance to capsid if your body has never seen it. Okay, so I pulled these in. This is not from the conference, but just to give you some background on this new class of drug. HIV life cycle. So hopefully this looks familiar, right? So here's your HIV virus infecting a CD4 T cell. The membranes fuse and it releases this core into the cell nucleus, the cell cytoplasm. And this green football shaped structure is what we call the capsid. Okay, so it houses all of the key essential ingredients of the HIV virus. It houses the RNA, the genetic material, and that capsid also houses the really important enzymes that the virus needs to replicate. Enzymes that don't exist in our human cells, so reverse transcriptase, right? Integrase. So what happens is, now the capsid is in our CD4 cell, okay, reverse transcription starts to happen. We have to turn that RNA into DNA, right? Because our genetic material is DNA, and the virus's genetic material is RNA. So reverse transcription means that the virus turns that RNA into DNA, and then this whole capsid comes into the nucleus. Then it dissociates, it breaks apart. And this is now, the original RNA has become DNA, and now the virus DNA version can be integrated into our cell's DNA. And then the virus basically uses our CD4 cells and turns them into little HIV factories. So it takes over that cell and it turns that cell into a machine to make a lot more new viruses that then bud off. And then these viruses can go on and infect other CD4 cells. And that's what we want to halt with all of these medications that we use. So with the capsid inhibitor, it works to inhibit all the important steps that green capsid core, those proteins are involved in. And you can see it impacts the life cycle at multiple stages. Okay, so it's interesting as a new drug because most of the other drugs we think about impact one stage. So if we want to talk about NRTIs, the nukes or the NNRTIs, they work at this stage. If we want to talk about integrase inhibitors, they limit integration at that step. Okay, so the capsid inhibitor just has a unique mechanism of action that it affects multiple stages. Okay, so the first place, and I won't go into this particular data so much, but just to give you the background, the first place that we looked at using this drug was in people who had limited treatment options, the most in-need population. So someone who is what we call heavily treatment experienced, meaning they've been exposed to a lot of those classes of older drugs, and multi-drug resistant, meaning that they've developed resistance to many of those classes of drugs. So they again have it's challenging to keep those people undetectable because we don't have a lot of active drugs. So the study was done in that population to see, can we add this drug, new class, 100% effective, pair it with some other recycled older drugs that still have some activity and get those people undetectable. And so the good news was the study was successful, and that drug is now on the market already as Sunlenca. Okay, so this is a drug, again, just for that indication. And I forgot to mention the most important feature of this new drug is that it's dosed as an injection twice a year. Okay, so that really, again, if you think about, we talked about Cabenuva as being the first step into long-acting injectables, what this is taking us into is the next step, which is, could we get an injectable that could last longer? Okay, now the caveat to that is that Sunlenca, the way it's currently approved, it's great that it's dosed twice a year, but you can't use monotherapy, right? You can't just use Sunlenca twice a year. You still have to take it with other HIV medications. So it's not a true twice a year regimen. The goal is to find a partner, and I do have some pipeline, data that much earlier in development of pairing lenacapavir with other agents as a twice yearly injection/infusion. Okay, so that's kind of the vision for the future, is that instead of having to take a pill every day or a couple pills every day, or have to come in every 2 months for an injection, what if you could go to your provider twice a year, get your labs done, catch up on your other, blood pressure monitoring, cholesterol monitoring, all that good stuff, and then get an injection infusion of your HIV med, walk out the door and not have to think about it for 6 months. It's like going to the dentist, right? Hopefully you do that every 6 months-ish. But something like that, right? So that's kind of what we're aiming for. And then the other place that we're looking at using this twice a year drug is in HIV prevention. Okay, so we have about 15?
Yeah.
Okay, so
20
about 20. Okay, so let me shift gears. So I'm giving you all that background about lenacapavir because a lot of what's in development with Gilead is using that drug. So I'm going to come back to that. So right now, that was just kind of sharing you a little bit about what that drug is, that new class of drug, what it's currently approved for, which is again in that late stage limited treatment options model. Okay, and then in a second, I'll show you what we're kind of anticipating for later this year to have this drug approved as an option for prevention. So a twice yearly injection for PrEP. Before I get to that though, I wanted to share some of the other, non-drug related data from CROI on PrEP. And so, I thought this was a really interesting study because have you guys heard the concept that HIV is a zip code disease? Does that make sense? So that it has a lot to do with social determinants of health, where you live, how you live, what resources you have available to you, right? And so what I like about this study is it's the first time they've tried, well, one of the first times at least that I've seen, that they've tried to use that zip code in understanding the disparities in access to PrEP in our populations. Okay, so they use this new analysis called index of concentration at the extremes. And they basically took something like race and ethnicity. And they said, who are the most privileged race in the US? And they broke it into quintiles of 5 groups. And they wanted to compare access to PrEP in the people that are most privileged in the US compared to those that are least privileged. They looked at income, so high income, most privileged, lower income, least privileged. They looked at educational, level of education. So all of these things at the extremes, right, to say how are populations that are most access, driven, most privileged compared to those that are not. And what they found, and again, this is not surprising, but I think it's just, it's good if we're thinking about how we're going to end the epidemic, we need to really understand what's happening and how we can reach the people that we're not reaching right now. And so what this is showing us is that if they look at the extremes for race and income combined, the most privileged group is shown here, and the most underprivileged group is shown here. And this is showing the PrEP to need ratio on the y-axis. What that means is, of the zip codes we're looking at, how many people could benefit from PrEP, and then what percentage of those people are actually on PrEP. So a low PrEP to need ratio means we're not reaching the people we need to reach. A high PrEP to need ratio is a good thing. So not surprisingly, right, the most privileged group in purple has a much higher PrEP to need ratio. More people are accessing PrEP when they're in a state of privilege, right, compared to our most underprivileged group over here. And what I think is really a little bit discouraging is that if we're looking at data from 2019 to 2023, that gap is getting worse. Okay. And I forgot to mention, so at CROI this year, it was very sobering. There was a giant elephant in the room at every presentation. And it was, of course, what the administration is doing, right? Cutting funds, cutting funds, cutting funds. And probably the most sobering statistic I heard was that when we looked at all that epi data early on, one of the presenters said that they modeled out, by cutting PEPFAR and cutting some of these, major funding sources for HIV treatment, in the world, we could see our HIV numbers go back to numbers that we saw in 2005. It'll set the clock back 20 years. And you think we've been clawing and clawing and clawing our way to where we are today. And you saw on those early slides, we're still not where we want to be, right? Our goals for that 90%, we're nowhere near that. We have to claw more. And then we have this happen. And so it was really like, I felt it everywhere. And you know, I know you were there as well. For the first time in 12 years that I've been attending this conference, there was a rally for science. And you've probably been going on and have, I don't know, at least in my time, I've never seen that before. So, you know, it's unfortunate. So I think data like this really is, again, it's sorry to be like a Debbie Downer in this moment, but you know, but this is the reality. We're going to see these disparities get worse as we cut funds and cut resources, unfortunately. So we need to find ways around that and whatever we can do as a community to overcome that. Okay, so we're focusing on PrEP now, right? So when we're talking about HIV prevention, we're getting people to A, recognize that, you know, they can benefit from being on PrEP. And then B, we prescribe the PrEP. But then the biggest challenge, just like with HIV treatment, is taking it long term, right? And so this analysis, this is using the IQVIA database. It's basically looking at pharmacy claims data for people that were given a PrEP prescription. And we're looking at PrEP persistence. So what are the odds that someone that I hand a PrEP prescription to today, this is oral PrEP that we're talking about, Truvada, Descovy, what are the odds that they'll be on it in 6 months? And what this data shows us is only about 40%. Okay, would be on it beyond 6 months. And that percentage decreased over time. So we know that, right, the challenge with taking something every day, like oral PrEP, to prevent HIV is only effective if you take it every day. And one of the saddest things that you hear about is people who have a PrEP prescription on file that then seroconvert, they get HIV. Because you know that they knew at some point enough that, you know, to seek out something to help protect them. But at the time that they needed it, unfortunately, you know, they hadn't been taking it or whatever the case may be. You know, COVID also impacted this greatly, where people fell off of their PrEP during COVID because they didn't want to go in the clinics and get tested and things like that. So the challenge with PrEP is, number one, having people know that they're at risk, but number two is having them take the medicine consistently. So one of the, again, strategies around that is now moving into the long-acting injectables, right? So now we have a drug on the market, Apretude, which is what we talked about earlier with Cabenuva for treatment. This is just the cabotegravir part of that. So instead of using 2 drugs, we're just using the one, cabotegravir, as PrEP. And the drug is also injected again. It's an IM injection every 2 months. And so this is, you know, there've been a number of large studies that were done, you know, by the company that got the drug approved. This is now, you know, several years out, looking at one strategy that was done. This was the Whitman Walker Clinic in Washington, D.C., where number one, they wanted to see, can we increase uptake of this novel PrEP option by having peer injectors? So they trained people from the, you know, peer specialists within the community that could really relate to the population that they were trying to reach, right? And then those were the people who were giving the injection and following up with the patients. So in that model, what they show here is, I'm just going to highlight a couple of things, is the discontinuation rate. Again, 6 injections, this is actually out to a year. Remember, this is every 2 months. But about a quarter of the patients discontinue over the course of the year. Okay, so even simplifying it to an injection every 2 months versus a daily pill, we still struggle with that persistence, right? How do we keep people on drug? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. So this analysis is interesting because this is saying, let's talk to people who could benefit from PrEP and see what do they want? What is their vision of optimal delivery of PrEP? Maybe that's where we need to go. That's what we need to develop. So this was an online survey that was targeting HIV negative transgender and gender diverse individuals. And they gave them hypotheticals, right? They didn't call out drug names or anything, but they said, what if you could have a PrEP protection drug that was injected every 2 months? That exists. A daily oral pill, that exists. What about an injection every 6 months? That's what we're trying to develop. What about an annual implant? What about a monthly oral pill? Okay, assuming that these were all equally effective at preventing HIV, what's your number one choice? And so turns out a monthly oral pill was for this group at least, was the most preferred. Okay, so what this tells us is that there is no one size that fits all, right? As drug companies are developing, like, okay, every 2 months seems too much. Here we are, Gilead, trying to develop an injection every 6 months. Well, maybe what people want is just a less frequent pill, right? They don't want needles. They don't want to have to go to a doctor's office to get a shot every X amount of months, whatever. Okay, so I think this is another important aspect of research have to keep in mind is to go to the source, find out from the population we're trying to reach. There are a lot of what we call target populations, the people that are less likely to be accessing PrEP today, right? If we look at the CDC estimated about 1.1 million people in the US that could benefit from PrEP. Right now, we have about 30% of those people on PrEP. So how do we reach the other 2/3 of the population, right? And then if we break it down by race and ethnicity, we see that most of the people that are accessing PrEP are white MSM populations. But where do we see the new HIV infections? Black MSM, Latino MSM. Okay, they're less likely to be accessing PrEP. So what are we missing in this equation, right? Why are those populations not seeking this out? Is it because they don't know about it? Is it a knowledge gap that we need to bridge? Is it stigma? It's probably a little bit of all of that, but so what can we do to make it better, to make it more accessible, to normalize the conversations around it? And then as drug companies, we're looking at what can we develop to make it easier? And what do patients want, right? So, okay, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes, I won't go too far into this, but I think this is what we're really excited about right now, which is this using lenacapavir, that capsid inhibitor we talked about, as a twice-yearly injection for PrEP. Okay, so 2 large studies were done. The Purpose 1 study, which is shown on the screen here, which was done in adolescent girls and young women, okay, in South Africa and Uganda. And if you may or may not know, right now for Descovy, we can't use it. It's not indicated in cisgender women. So this study kind of addressed 2 things. We got data on Descovy efficacy in cisgender women, and we're also getting data on this novel injectable PrEP, twice-yearly PrEP. And the way these studies were designed is super interesting, but in the interest of time, I think I'll skip over that and try and just get to the meat of it. So the Purpose 2 study is a parallel study that was done in basically everyone else. So cisgender men who have sex with men, transgender women, gender non-binary individuals. So it was a very inclusive study. And again, the active research arm was looking at the efficacy of this twice-yearly injection. Okay. And what we're comparing it to is background HIV incidence. Okay, so I will mention this briefly because I think this is interesting. Right, the early PrEP studies from years ago, iPreps, for example, that got Truvada approved for PrEP back in 2012. That compared Truvada, the experimental arm, to placebo. Okay, and of course it showed that Truvada was efficacious at preventing HIV and ultimately led to Truvada getting approved. So now fast forward to today, we have Truvada, we have Descovy, and we have the injectable Apretude that have all been FDA approved for PrEP. So when you think about how do we study a new drug for PrEP, we can't compare it to placebo, right? That's not ethical to potentially put somebody at risk for HIV on a placebo drug. And doing what we call head-to-head studies, where we compare Truvada to Descovy or Apretude to Truvada, gets harder and harder to do because our existing PrEP medicines are very effective. So in order to do a statistically relevant study, those studies have to be very big, lots of people, or very long, right? So they're kind of clunky studies. So Gilead worked very closely with the FDA to say, how else can we study HIV prevention that makes sense? And so, after much back and forth, this is the new model for studying PrEP. And, you'll see it here, but I guarantee you'll see it in future PrEP studies, with other agents that come, is to say, if you conduct this study in an area that has high background rate of HIV, you can use that, what the background rate in that community is, as your control arm. And then you can see how does this intervention impact that. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so that's why the women's study was done in South Africa and Uganda, right? We talked earlier, way earlier, 53% of the global population is cisgender women. Well, most of those women are in South Africa and Uganda, so it makes sense to do that study there. Okay, so here are the results. And when these results were presented, it was pretty groundbreaking, I would say. Actually, Science Magazine in 2024 named lenacapavir for PrEP the breakthrough of the year. Okay, so we were obviously very excited to see magazine they've been doing molecule of the year or breakthrough of the year since like the mid-80s. And HIV related things, this was only the third time that it's been the breakthrough or molecule of the year. So one was prevention of maternal to child transmission, one was U equals U, and I think this is the third one.
Not protease with copy.
Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it was protease, not the prevention of maternal to child. Protease, U equals U, and then but I'm gonna look it up. I haven't brought that tidbit out for a while, and I realized I don't remember exactly. But anyway, it was only 3 times, so it was very exciting. And it was because of this. Okay, so in this large study, and I didn't get into all the details, the Purpose 1 study enrolled over 5,000 adolescent girls and young women. Okay, and out of over 2,000 that were placed on the injection as the active arm of the study, there were zero seroconversions. Okay, if you look at the background rate of HIV, it was 2.41 per 100 person years. So this is a very statistically significant result. What was also a little bit disappointing is that if you look at the 2 oral arms, so this is Descovy and this is Truvada, the seroconversion rates here were not different than the background rate. So in this study, we looked at oral PrEP efficacy and injectable. Only the injectable showed efficacy, and I'm going to come back to that point. Okay, Purpose 2 is, again, a different patient population. Here, there were 2 seroconversions among over 2,000 people on the injection, so also significantly lower than background, and again, significantly lower than the oral PrEP option. Okay, so let's see.
It's only on women.
What's that?
The study was only on women.
Purpose 1 was women. Purpose 2 was basically everyone else. Yeah. Okay. So this answers the question of, so we're back to why did oral PrEP not work in cisgender women, right? It was just because they didn't take it. This is looking at adherence. So on the bottom here, I'll have you focus down here. So we can measure adherence to Truvada Descovy by looking at dry blood spot tests. So basically you take a drop of blood, you can analyze the concentration of tenofovir diphosphate, one of the components of Truvada Descovy, in that drop of blood. And based on that concentration, you can estimate that this person take their oral PrEP more than 4 times a week on average, less than 2 times a week, okay, or somewhere in between. So I'm going to have you focus on the low adherence group. So these are people who, again, from those dry blood spot test results, it appeared that their concentrations were consistent with them taking 0 to 1 doses per week only. Okay. And as early as 8 weeks, 2 months into the study, already about 1/3 to 50% of the patients were not taking their PrEP. When you get out to a year, 85 to 90+% were not taking their PrEP. Okay, so this really speaks to, again, the best PrEP for the patient sitting in front of you is the PrEP that they're willing to take. Okay, in South Africa and Uganda, it's a very different power dynamic, right, for women. And I think that has a lot to do with why PrEP studies in South Africa and Uganda with oral PrEP at least have not been effective, is because women can't be seen taking PrEP. They can't be seen with the bottle there's a lot more stigma associated with that. And fear. In Purpose One, I think it's a very, again, sobering statistic. If you look at the article, the publication, is that there were 6 deaths in that study. The women enrolled in that study were aged 16 to 25. So how did 6 of them die in the course of that study? If you look at the cause of death, one was strangulation, one was non-accidental burns, one was a stab wound to the chest, one was a traumatic motor vehicle related incident, and then only 2 out of 6 of them were like medical reasons. One of them had ovarian cancer, one of them had a heart issue. But 4 of those women died very violent deaths, right? And I think that speaks to when we talk about adherence, we're not blaming the patient, right? Why can't you just take your medicine every day? It's not that. It's what fits into their lifestyle, what is safe for them, what can they persistently do over time, right? And that's why, there's a lot of excitement about lenacapavir for PrEP in certain populations. It's definitely not going to be for everyone, right? I'm sure you all know some like don't come anywhere near me with the needle. I'd rather take a pill every day, right? So, but I think what we're seeing for the future of HIV treatment and prevention is choice. Imagine having those choices. You're newly diagnosed and you sit down with your provider and they're like, here are 4 choices. They're all 1 tablet once a day, which is crazy, right? Or PrEP, do you want to take a pill every day? Do you want to take on-demand PrEP? Take it when you need it. Do you want to do an injection every 2 months? Do you want to do an injection every 6 months, right? And find out again, what is aligning with what that patient needs and can stay consistent. Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's it.
10 minutes? Okay, I'm gonna jump ahead then. So let me mention this briefly. So talk about the era of choice. What if we had a once-a-year injection for PrEP? So this is really exciting data that we presented. This is just PK data. So pharmacokinetic data showing a new formulation of lenacapavir that Gilead is working on that could be dosed once a year. So instead of a sub-Q injection twice a year, it would be a once-a-year IM intramuscular injection. And what these graphs are showing us is just, we looked at 2 different formulations of lenacapavir in this new intramuscular form. And the gray lines represent the concentrations we achieved with the twice-yearly lenacapavir that we just talked about being effective. And then the green and the blue lines are showing you what was achieved with this 1 time a year injection. So you can see we overshot it, which is good because these injections, it's 2 5 ml IM injections. So those are big, hefty injections. What our clinical development team has promised us, I don't know if we can hold them to it, is because this PK looks so good, they feel like they can probably go back on the dose a little bit and hopefully get that volume of injection down. But I think the novelty of this is imagine a once a year PrEP drug. So people were talking about the twice yearly len is maybe the closest we'll have to a vaccine against HIV. But to me, a once yearly injection really is close to getting your flu shot every year, your COVID shot every year. So it's very exciting. So this is actually, once we show what we call bioequivalence, we show that this once a year formulation reaches drug levels consistent with the twice a year formulation. The FDA will allow us to start studies. So before the end of this year, we are going to roll out clinical trials that will already start studying a once a year, okay? And then the twice yearly that's further along in development, we're hoping to get a determination from the FDA as early as next month. So that's something that, may be coming very soon, fingers crossed. Okay, this is further out because we're still doing the studies, but just to give you a teaser of, again, when we talk about that menu of choices, now there'll potentially be something coming that's a once a year. Okay. So in the last few minutes, I just want to give you a peek at, again, shifting back to treatment now. I know we were just talking about prevention, but what are some things that are coming in what we call our pipeline that are in development for treatment? And you'll notice that most of these involve lenacapavir. So the interesting thing about lenacapavir, there's been a lot of interesting things about lenacapavir, but it's, oftentimes a drug is developed as an oral medication because it can't be given as an infusion. Or it's probably the flip is a better example. It's given as an injection because it's not well absorbed, given as a pill. Okay, so lenacapavir we've discovered is very malleable, where we can develop it as a once daily pill, we can develop it as a once weekly pill, we can potentially develop it as a once monthly pill. You saw in that survey that people were interested in a once monthly PrEP option, so we are looking into that. Or like you just saw, a twice yearly injectable or once yearly injection. So we can kind of play around with the formulation of the same active drug lenacapavir and do a lot of different things with it. So one of the compounds that's probably furthest along in development is this combination of bictegravir plus lenacapavir. So we talked a lot earlier about integrase inhibitors, the potency, the tolerability of bictegravir, what's in Biktarvy. And then we talked about lenacapavir and the uniqueness because it's a new class of drug, right? So what if we combine those two pills together in one pill? And the niche of patients that we're developing this combination for is not treatment naive patients, people who've never been on treatment, right? Nowadays, you already have a choice of like 3 or 4, if you look at all of them, right, 6 single tablet regimens that you can take. We don't really need another single tablet regimen in that space. Where we do is, we have patients that are on multi-tablet regimens. They're on more complicated than one pill once a day regimens. Why? Because they have had resistance over the years. And so they can't get away with just taking one of those available single tablet regimens. So this combination is hoping to address that niche of patients. So I would have patients come in and say, all of my friends living with HIV are on 1 tablet. Why do you have me on 2? And it's not by choice, it's because, you have to because of resistance. Those are the patients that we want to give an option of a once daily tablet to. So lenacapavir, again, because it's a new class of drug, we know will be effective. And then bictegravir, we don't see a lot of resistance to the modern integrase inhibitors, dolutegravir, bictegravir. So there's a good chance that that combination will work. And so that's what this study did. They enrolled people who were undetectable, but were on complex regimens. Okay, so typically that meant multi-tablet regimens, which I'll show you. So this is an example of what most of these patients were on. So about 1/3 of them were on a boosted PI plus an integrase inhibitor plus a nuke or 2. So a common version of that is, Resista, dolutegravir, and Descovy. Or they were on a protease inhibitor and an integrase inhibitor. So again, had to be 2 pills, right? So they took individuals who, for various reasons, predominantly because of history of resistance, probably about 80% of them were on these multi-tablet regimens because of resistance. And they looked at switching them to one of these single tablet combinations of bictegravir plus lenacapavir. And overall, I'm just going to focus on the overall, all participants. We studied 2 different doses of lenacapavir. We are moving forward with this one, but you can see regardless of the dose, over 90% of people stayed undetectable on these new regimens. Okay, so this is moving into the next phase of study, which is phase 3. It will be co-formulated into 1 tablet. And so this is something that will hopefully be coming relatively soon in the next couple of years. Okay, I'll touch on this briefly because I mentioned it earlier, right? Lenacapavir in its current formulation needs to be taken with for HIV treatment, with other medications. But we really want to envision a future where someone could be, not on a PrEP regimen twice a year, but on an HIV treatment regimen twice a year. And so this was what started off as kind of a proof of concept, and it moved into phase 2, but it was looking at combining lenacapavir as a sub-Q injection at twice a year with 2 broadly neutralizing antibodies. So broadly neutralizing antibodies are being studied for a number of things right now within HIV for both treatment and prevention and cure. But in this context, we're taking people who are undetectable on oral medications and switching them to this combination of sub-Q injection lenacapavir plus 2 IV infusions of broadly neutralizing antibodies. Okay. So, and, just to show you, this is a small study, 83 individuals. They were randomized 2-to-1 to go on the experimental 6-month regimen versus continuing their regimen. And you can see at the end of 6 months, 96+% were still undetectable. So this is also moving forward. It's a little bit clunky, right? It's not ideal that you need an IV infusion and an injection, but it is twice a year. So, we don't know yet if this is going to be the twice a year goal. We're still looking at other formulations and things to make it something simpler perhaps, but proof of concept, we can control HIV with a twice yearly option. Okay, and then I'll close with this. So what about a once a week pill? Right? So, we saw in the PrEP survey, some people wanted a once a month pill, once a week pill. So again, not for everyone. I've had people say, well, once a week, like, I'm not going to remember that. I'd rather take something every day than once a week, right? And other people are like, well, I could take it every Sunday when I go to church. Like there's something that they do every week very consistently. And it would be nice to not have to worry about taking pills every day. So there's a couple formulations. This is one of them. This is looking at a combination of islatravir, which is actually a Merck product, and then lenacapavir as a weekly pill. Okay, so again, without getting into the nitty gritty, but just as a concept, you can see that the experimental arm in gray here did just as well as the oral arm. And so this is also moving forward. So the future of HIV treatment too is going to be a very, extended menu of options. An injectable. You want a long-acting injectable every 2 months, maybe every 6 months. That's a little ways out. You want to be on a weekly pill, right? So I think the exciting thing is just what's coming. So I will skip over that and we can stop. Okay.
Any questions? Use the mic.
Is there attempts to go for longer lasting oral medications? And what's the situation about implants? Because there was talk about some time back.
Yeah, so I don't know if you have
As treatment, not PrEP.
as treatment, yeah. I don't know of anything too far along on the implant side for treatment. As far as longer acting, certainly nothing more than every 6 months, as far as I'm aware. But these long-acting oral combinations, I think, are probably so once a week, and maybe there's some drug companies that are developing once a month orals. But a lot of the challenge with these longer acting agents is you always have to find a partner that can also be dosed at that interval, right? So a second drug, right? Because we know with treatment, we learned this a long time ago, monotherapy doesn't work. We need at least 2 active drugs. And so, just like what we ran into with lenacapavir, where we had this great potent every 6 months, but we need to find a partner to go with it. The broadly neutralizing antibodies is one answer, but like I said, it's clunky, it's cumbersome, it's not accessible. Not everyone has access to an infusion center to do this. So it's not ideal, but maybe there's a version of that in the future that would be an injectable that's given twice a year, right? So again, that's hypothetical. That's not in development for us at least.
Thank you. Will the data from the Purpose One study allow doctors here in the United States to prescribe Descovy?
Good question. So we did file the data from Purpose One and Purpose Two with the FDA for lenacapavir for PrEP, right? But we all for women and for the whole population. Your question is around Descovy, right? Because the Purpose One study also studied Descovy in cisgender women, which was a data gap that we didn't have before. And unfortunately, right, I showed you that the data didn't look good, but it was because of adherence. And I didn't go into the details on that same slide when we looked at adherence. We also did what's called a case control study. So we looked at, of the women who were on active Descovy in Purpose One, 37 of them seroconverted, got HIV. And then we looked at their drug levels using that dry blood spot technology. And then we compared it to matched controls from that same study, matched, they do like a voice matching. So they're matched by how high their HIV risk is, right, to be well matched. And they looked at what their drug levels were. And not surprisingly, you were much less likely to have seroconverted on Descovy if you had good adherence. So based on that case control data, we also submitted that to the FDA, hoping to get an indication for Descovy for PrEP and cisgender women based on that. Okay, so, we're not sure, honestly, we're not sure what the FDA is going to do with that information. We're hoping that that's enough to get an indication, but we'll have to see.
Do you find that people, do you find that providers are prescribing it anyway off-label? Right?
Yeah, I think that data definitely made people more, I know providers were already doing it more often just for medical legal reasons when there was a strong reason to do it. If someone had kidney issues or some intolerance to Truvada, okay, fine, then we'll use Descovy. Versus I think in, the MSM population where we do have an indication, people are much more comfortable using Descovy up front. I will say that data has given people just more confidence to be able to back up their decision to use Descovy in cisgender women. But I still think that, it's off-label use. And I think in the US, there's a lot of concerns about legal ramifications. And so you really want to document that, you've had the conversation, that you've seen the data, whatever the case may be, so that you feel, that you've covered all the bases.
Well, also,
Insurance coverage,
But it was that much showed that off-label.
Yeah, sure.
There you go.
And that's true. I haven't heard people having trouble getting it covered for cisgender women. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. That's a lot of good information. I was wondering, I forget the name of the new medication, the lenacapavir, and the slide it attacked the virus at 3 different points.
Yeah.
And maybe I misunderstand in the past, but I thought that's why I needed to take multiple medications to hit all those different spots. So I know you just stated that mono treatment that you learned, it doesn't work, but
yeah. So
then, second follow-up to that, one of your first slides showed Australia as a dark color, and it says that they're in I think it was right after this slide or something,
okay.
where you broke down the
map, yeah, the global
map.
map.
And I remember at the beginning when I became positive in the 90s that Australia was like a leader in safe sex promotion and using condoms and all that stuff. So I guess I was surprised to see it as a dark color. Thank you.
Great. So thanks for that comment. Actually, a really good point, right? I've had conversations prior to lenacapavir coming out when we started looking at using 2 drugs instead of 3 drugs, right? And if we look back to the early days when we were just developing nukes one at a time, AZT3, TC, D4T, back then when we tried using 2 drugs, 2 of those nukes, it didn't work. But now when we fast forward to today, we can do things like dolutegravir, rilpivirine, Juluca, or Dovato, dolutegravir 3TC, and we see that 2 drugs sometimes seems okay. So what is, to your point, it was always like, well, we want to hit the virus at different parts in that life cycle. Maybe 2 points is enough and we don't need, 3 drugs. So when we first saw the mechanism of action for lenacapavir, it was intriguing for that reason, because we're like, maybe we could get away with monotherapy because it's affecting the life cycle at all these different stages for that very reason that you brought up. And we learned very quickly in our early clinical trials with lenacapavir. Remember, they're in people with very limited treatment options. And typically what happened was the people who developed resistance to lenacapavir in that study, and there were about 9 of them, who did, it turned out all of them we could explain because they were on monotherapy. So it was either that they had so much drug resistance that even though the provider tried to put them on some kind of oral optimized, background to go along with the lenacapavir, that there were really no fully active drugs in that other combination. So they were effectively on lenacapavir monotherapy. Or what was probably more common was that the injection you can control. You bring them to the doctor's office, the injection went in twice a year, but then we send them out to say, take your pills every day. And oftentimes the patients wouldn't be able to be adherent with these, what's left of their complex oral regimen. And so they would again effectively be on lenacapavir monotherapy. And so from that study, we learned that, yeah, monotherapy is not going to cut it. Okay, even though it has this very novel mechanism of action that hits multiple stages of the life cycle, we're still in that same boat where one drug is not, unfortunately.
I thought you also said at the beginning that
The lenacapavir wouldn't have any mutations or what, I forget the word, but
Yeah,
resistance.
right. So
Because it's a new medication that no one had experienced, but you just said 9 people.
yes.
Yeah.
So the way the drug resistance develops is typically you have to be on the drug and sort of be on not a fully suppressive regimen, right? So when I said that it's a new class of drug that's coming out, that you don't have, that these individuals who have developed multi-drug resistance over the years would still have effectiveness from this drug, it's because it's a different class of drug. So when someone develops resistance to nukes like AZT-D4T in the early days, there's a lot of what we call cross resistance. So if you develop enough mutations in that NRTI section of the HIV genetic kind of structure, if you accumulate enough mutations, you can knock out the entire new class, right? So AZT, D4T, 3TC, FTC, all of those drugs can be gone. But if you introduce a new class of drug, so in this case, the capsid inhibitor lenacapavir, there's no cross resistance, meaning that resistance that they develop to all of those nukes won't touch this drug because this is a capsid inhibitor. It's a different class. It needs different mutations to get resistance, right? So that's what I meant in that initial statement. The having a novel class of drug available, just that a patient has never been on, just means that that drug will work because they haven't developed resistance to that drug yet. But it doesn't mean that they can't develop resistance to the drug. So now we put all those patients that were multi-drug resistant on lenacapavir in the study with other drugs, right, to form a cocktail, so to speak. And we found that some of them developed resistance to lenacapavir, but the ones who developed resistance to lenacapavir were the ones who were on effectively monotherapy because they weren't on the others. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Can I ask
So,
one more question?
yeah, of course.
Just last month, I have a really great infectious disease new doctor, Dr. Kakar. And last month she asked if I wanted to switch from Triumec to Biktarvy.
Mhm.
And I've been on Tivicay and Triumec for at least a decade or more.
Mhm.
And she said there's a lot of scientific information discovery coming up to not for people who have been on Triumec for a long time. And I'm thinking at this conference you were at, she didn't explain too much more than what I've just said,
Okay.
but I did switch to Biktarvy. I've been on it like a month today. She said it was a lateral change,
Mhm.
but do you know what that scientific research is and why she wanted to switch me pretty
Yeah,
bad?
I have a pretty good guess.
Thank you.
So Triumec contains dolutegravir, which is an integrase inhibitor, and then the nuke backbone in Triumec is a baclovir and 3TC. So my guess is what she was referring to was the data that has come out relatively recently about increased risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, those types of things related to abacavir use. Now this has been buzzing around in the data for a long time, and it's been controversial, right? Because it's hard to study. When drug companies, for example, do studies on Triumec, the studies are typically in 30-year-old individuals, and they run for 3 years. You don't see heart attacks in people in their 30s for over 3 years, right? So to do a study where you can show a risk of actual cardiovascular events, again, it needs to be a very long study that needs to be followed over time, and those studies don't typically happen. Well, the Reprieve study is an amazing study that's been going on now for over well, I guess the first name was 5, maybe 7 years now, roughly. And what was nice about that study was it enrolled a very sort of uniform population of people at the outset, and then it followed those people over time. And then the other key, and I'll come back to that, and then the other key thing is that the outcomes that they looked at in that study was major adverse cardiovascular events, or MACE. So actual hard endpoints, someone had a heart attack or had to have revascularization or had a stroke, things like that. And the reason I say this was a really kind of well-selected patient population is that everyone who was enrolled in the study had to be at least 40. So we're getting into not by any means that 40 is old, but we're getting into the age range where cardiovascular disease starts to, be visible. They were obviously all living with HIV, but importantly, they were all on treatment and undetectable, right? We know that untreated HIV, having active virus in the body, is a huge risk factor for cardiovascular disease because of the inflammation that causes. So we level the playing field when we look at a population of people who are all undetectable on treatment. So we've removed that variable, right? And then also, everyone enrolling in the study had, your doctor may talk to you about calculating your cardiovascular risk. So they look at your age, they look at your cholesterol levels, your blood pressure, and you can plug all that into an equation and say your 10-year risk of having a heart attack is X%. Okay, so they specifically enrolled people in the study who had never had it, or hadn't had any kind of major adverse cardiovascular event already, importantly, but also B, that their risk score was very low. So, the primary study was looking at using statins, cholesterol medicines. So, we can come back to that, but they wanted to enroll people who wouldn't normally have been put on a statin. Their cardiovascular risk was, low to moderate, where by current, at the time standards, we wouldn't even recommend starting them on a statin, a cholesterol-lowering medication. And then they followed these people over time, right? So embedded in that very large study, there were over 7,000 people enrolled in this international study. They're able to do other sub-analyses. And one of the ones that they did was to look at any association with use of certain classes of ART or certain specific ART regimens. So they looked at abacavir, they looked at tenofovir, so TDF, TAF, probably mostly TDF. They looked at boosted PIs, and they looked at thymidine analog, so AZTD4T. And they wanted to see if any of these specific drugs showed a trend towards more heart attacks, major adverse cardiovascular events. And out of all of that analysis, all of those different drug classes and drugs that they studied, the only one that kind of floated to the top is showing some significant correlation with increased risk of cardiovascular events was abacavir. So based on that study, the DHHS guidelines, ISUSA guidelines all updated the recommendations. And for the first time, Triumec was removed from the recommended regimens, right, for people who are initiating treatment. Because we have better drugs today. We don't need to do that, right? To put somebody at increased risk for heart disease. And so, I think that was a smart conversation she had with you, because on top of that, we look at people who are living longer with HIV, they're aging with HIV. And guess what? The older we get, the higher our risk for cardiovascular diseases anyway. Then you factor in increasing odds of having hypertension, high cholesterol, diabetes as we get older. All of those things can increase your risk. So why also have someone on a drug that might increase their risk, right? So I think that's probably what she was referring to when she made that recommendation.
Thank you so much.
Terrific. One last question.
With the current chaos going on in the health departments of the United States, how do you see the future of getting any drugs approved or developments at all? Because it's just all a disaster.
Wow, look at the time.
Sorry, I know you can't predict the future, but what do you see
I
as
think it's
capabilities?
it's something that weighs on all of us, whatever we're doing in the field. It definitely affects people at the front lines who are treating, people who are providing prevention services, and a lot of those, extra support for keeping those services afloat, funding cuts are affecting that. Your question is around drug development. I mean, I think it's probably less likely to affect like pharmaceutical company drug development. Because we're not funded by the federal funds, things that they have control over cutting. That's my very basic understanding of that. How will things get approved? You know, like we were anticipating a June 19th approval for lenacapavir for PrEP. And as we've been out there talking with our community about it, you know, I can't tell you how many times it's come up. In the beginning, we were laughing about it, but now we're like, oh my God, it's not even funny. But like, well, if we still have an FDA come June, you know? And so I remember hearing that like in early January and being like, you know, and now I'm like, oh my God, like seriously, if we have an FDA come June, right? So those cuts and how, you know, I think will affect the downstream impact of these drugs that are being developed. Whether it's at the approval level, you know, at the like access level, once they're approved, you know, I think those things will likely be affected. And, you know, I don't know beyond that, what the answer is, but it's,
Yeah, I can weigh in.
okay.
As you know, we receive NIH funds, and so even groups that haven't had their funding cut are having trouble getting their money because all these indiscriminate layoffs that Musk has done across the entire federal government. They've removed the administrators who handle the money, who handle the grants. Same thing in the FDA, they've lost people as well. So it's not, you know, they're still going to do their jobs. They're still going to approve drugs that have good data supporting their approval, but do they have the people to make those deals turn inside there?
Will it take longer?
Yeah, we end up taking longer.
Yeah.
This all remains to be seen. Hopefully there'll be a revolt in between now and then. So Cathy, thank you so much. That was terrific.
Thank you all.
That was damn much for all of us who can go home and decompress. And just one announcement. I think it was last month when we had the Anthony from Velasco from DAP talked about the colon cancer, and we talked about the shortage of anoscopists here in the valley. So Eisenhower is hiring a new one, which in Carrie Sudemeyer is leaving, but they're hiring someone from LA named Jason Kaufman, who he's already started, and he's going to start seeing patients at Eisenhower. So there is another option. So if you need that, you know, do reach out to them. They can select different plans.
He has extensive experience.
Yeah, he's very highly experienced. From the LGBT community. So thank you, and we'll see you next month.